The scorching Arizona sun hung mercilessly in the cloudless sky as Delia Harrison's parched lips cracked and her vision blurred, the endless miles of desert terrain finally claiming what little strength remained in her exhausted body. 3 days without proper water, fleeing from the remnants of her shattered life in Tucson, had pushed her beyond human endurance. As consciousness slipped away and her knees buckled beneath her threadbare skirt, the last thing she registered was a cloud of dust on the horizon and the rhythmic pounding of approaching hooves. Mason Garrett pulled back on the reins of his stallion, Thunderbolt, squinting through the heat waves rising from the baked earth. The prone figure lying in the dust hadn't been there when he'd ridden this trail yesterday. Wariness honed by 5 years as a ranch foreman made him scan the surrounding terrain for signs of an ambush before dismounting. Finding none, he approached cautiously, hand resting on the Colt revolver at his hip. "Madam," he called, but received no response from the motionless woman. Kneeling beside her, Mason gently turned her over, pushing back the wide-brimmed bonnet that had partially shielded her face from the sun. Despite the dust coating her features, he could see she was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with delicate features marred by exposure and dehydration. Her breathing came in shallow gasps. Without hesitation, Mason removed his canteen and lifted her head, carefully trickling water between her parched lips. "Easy now," he murmured, though she remained unconscious. "Just a little at a time." Decision made, Mason gathered the woman into his arms, surprised at how light she felt despite her full-length traveling dress. With practiced ease, he lifted her onto Thunderbolt's saddle, then mounted behind her, cradling her limp form against his chest to keep her from falling. "Hold on, miss," he said softly, turning his horse toward the Sleeping Creek Ranch where he worked. "Doc Miller will fix you right up." The journey back to the ranch took nearly an hour, during which time the woman stirred only once, murmuring something unintelligible before slipping back into unconsciousness. Mason kept one arm securely around her waist, the other holding the reins, uncomfortably aware of the way her head rested against his shoulder. As the main house of Sleeping Creek Ranch came into view, Mason called out to one of the ranch hands. "Tom, ride for Doc Miller." Found a woman collapsed out by Split Rock Pass. The next hours passed in a flurry of activity. Mrs. Peterson, the housekeeper, took charge of the mysterious woman, shooing Mason and the other curious ranch hands from the guest bedroom. By the time Doc Miller arrived from town, Mrs. Peterson had managed to clean the dust from the woman's face and change her into a borrowed nightgown. "Dehydration and exhaustion primarily," Doc Miller announced after his examination. "She's young and strong, though. With rest and proper care, she should recover fully." "Any idea who she might be?" asked Frederick Thornton, the ranch owner, who had returned from town shortly after Mason arrived with the unconscious woman. Doc Miller shook his head. "No identification on her, according to Mrs. Peterson." "We'll have to wait until she wakes up." Mason lingered in the hallway outside the guest bedroom after the others had dispersed. Something about the woman's desperate condition stirred protective instincts he'd thought long buried after losing his family to cholera 5 years earlier. What circumstances had driven her to such extremes, traveling alone through some of the most unforgiving territory in Arizona territory? "She'll sleep through the night," Mrs. Peterson said, startling Mason from his thoughts. "Doctor gave her something to help her rest." "No sense in you standing guard, Mr. Garrett," Mason nodded, embarrassed to be caught hovering. "Just concerned is all, never seen anyone so far gone out there alone." "Well, your concern saved her life, that's certain. Now get some rest yourself. Morning comes early on a ranch." But sleep eluded Mason that night. His mind kept returning to the woman's face, how vulnerable she had looked collapsed in the dust, how fragile she had felt in his arms as he lifted her into his saddle. By dawn, he had convinced himself his interest was merely that of any decent human being concerned for another's welfare. The woman Delia, they learned when she finally regained consciousness the following afternoon, had a different perspective on her rescue. "I owe you my life, Mr. Garrett," she said, her voice still raspy from dehydration when Mason was finally permitted to see her. Propped up against pillows, color returning to her cheeks, She looked remarkably different from the dust-covered figure he'd discovered in the desert. "Any traveler would have done the same," Mason replied, uncomfortable with her gratitude and acutely aware of her large hazel eyes studying him intently. "Perhaps. But it was you who found me, and for that, I am eternally grateful." She attempted a smile that transformed her face, despite her weakened condition. "Mrs. Peterson tells me you carried me all the way back to the ranch." Mason shifted his weight, his hat twisting in his hands. "Wasn't far, my horse did the work. Still, thank you." Her expression clouded suddenly. "I suppose you're all wondering what I was doing out there alone." "It's not my business to pry, Miss Harrison." "Delia, please," she sighed, looking down at her hands. "And I suppose it is your business since you saved my life. I was running away." Mason waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "My fiancé, former fiancé in Tucson. She hesitated. "He was not the man I believed him to be. When I discovered his true nature, I broke our engagement. He didn't take it well." "He hurt you?" Mason asked, his voice hardening. "He tried. I managed to escape, but I knew he wouldn't stop looking for me in town. I took what little money I had and fled." She gestured weakly. "Obviously, I was ill-prepared for the journey. Where were you headed?" "Anywhere he wasn't." Delia gave a small, bitter laugh. "I have an aunt in Santa Fe. I thought perhaps I could reach her." Mason nodded, understanding desperation all too well. "You're safe here at Sleeping Creek until you're recovered. Mr. Thornton has already said as much." "And then what?" she asked softly. "I have almost no money left, and Santa Fe is still hundreds of miles away." Before Mason could respond, Mrs. Peterson bustled into the room carrying a tray. "That's enough visiting for now, Mr. Garrett. Miss Harrison needs her rest." As Mason reluctantly took his leave, Delia caught his eye. "Thank you again, Mr. Garrett, truly." He tipped his hat awkwardly. "Mason, my name is Mason." Her smile followed him out the door. Over the next few days, as Delia regained her strength, Mason found himself inventing reasons to visit the main house. He brought wildflowers he claimed Mrs. Peterson had requested for the table. He delivered reports to Mr. Thornton that could easily have been handled by any other ranch hand. And each time, he managed to exchange a few words with Delia, learning a little more about the woman he'd rescued. She was 22, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a cavalry officer, both deceased. She had been working as a seamstress in Tucson when she met Edward Phillips, a banker's son who had swept her off her feet with charm and promises of security. "I was so naive," she confessed to Mason one evening as they sat on the front porch, the setting sun painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and gold. "I confused attention for affection, possessiveness for passion. What changed?" Mason asked, carefully whittling a small piece of wood, more to keep his hands busy than to create anything of value. "I overheard him speaking with his friends. He referred to me as a convenient arrangement until someone more suitable came along." Her voice grew quieter. "When I confronted him, he showed his true colors. Said no one would believe me over him, that his family owned half the businesses in Tucson." Mason's hands stilled. "And then he threatened you?" Delia nodded, unconsciously touching her wrist where faint bruises were still visible. "I packed what I could carry that night and left before dawn." Mason fought down a surge of anger at the unknown man who had driven Delia to such desperate measures. "He won't find you here," he said with quiet certainty. "I can't stay here forever, Mason. I've already imposed on Mr. Thornton's hospitality for too long." "You're earning your keep," Mason pointed out. After her second day of recovery, Delia had insisted on helping Mrs. Peterson with household chores, and her skilled needlework had already repaired several items around the ranch house. "It's not enough. I need to find a way to reach Santa Fe, or at least find employment somewhere far from Tucson." Mason hesitated, then made a decision. "There's a cattle drive starting next week. I'm leading a crew to Santa Fe. It would take about 3 weeks." Delia's eyes widened. "Are you suggesting I join a cattle drive?" "Not exactly." Mason set down his whittling. "Mr. Thornton's sister lives in Santa Fe. She comes to visit every Christmas but hasn't been able to make the journey this year because of her health. He's been looking to send her some things." "If you were traveling as her companion, you would do that for me?" Delia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'd have to speak with Mr. Thornton, but yes, it would give you safe passage to Santa Fe and the company of other travelers." The hope that blossomed on Delia's face made Mason's heart constrict in a way he hadn't experienced in years. When she impulsively reached out and squeezed his hand in gratitude, he felt the contact like a physical jolt. "Thank you, Mason. I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." "No need for repayment," he said gruffly, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting and how the fading light softened her features. "Just doing what's right." Frederick Thornton proved surprisingly amenable to Mason's suggestion. "Been wanting to send Martha some of her mother's china and those preserves Mrs. Peterson put up last fall," he said thoughtfully. "And I expect the poor girl could use a fresh start after what she's been through." "It's not exactly a comfortable journey," Mason warned. "Trail life is rough." Thornton waved away his concern. "Miss Harrison strikes me as tougher than she looks, and you'll be there to ensure her safety." And so it was arranged. Delia would accompany the cattle drive to Santa Fe, ostensibly as a companion carrying items to Thornton's sister. The ranch owner even advanced her a small sum as payment for her services, enough to establish herself once she reached her destination. The day before departure, Delia sought out Mason as he was checking supplies in the chuck wagon. "I want to thank you again," she said, her cheeks flushed with color that owed nothing to her recent illness. "You've been so kind to me, a complete stranger." Mason straightened from his inventory. "Not a stranger anymore," he corrected, allowing himself a rare smile. "No, I suppose not." She hesitated, then handed him a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I wanted you to have this. It's not much, but—" Mason carefully unwrapped the package to find a finely embroidered handkerchief, his initials stitched in one corner with intricate detail. "This is beautiful work," he said, genuinely impressed. "Mrs. Peterson had some sewing supplies she let me use. I wanted to give you something to remember me by," as if he could forget her. The thought came unbidden, surprising in its intensity. "Thank you," he said simply, tucking the handkerchief carefully into his shirt pocket. "I'll keep it safe." The cattle drive began at dawn the next day, 15 cowboys, including Mason, driving 2,000 head of cattle northward towards Santa Fe. Delia rode in the chuck wagon with Cookie, the elderly cook who grumbled about having a woman in his domain but quickly warmed to her when she demonstrated her skill at baking biscuits over an open fire. The first week passed without incident. Delia adapted to trail life with remarkable resilience, never complaining about the dust, the early mornings, or the simple fare. She kept mostly to herself, helping Cookie with meals and occasionally mending torn clothing for the cowboys, who treated her with a mixture of awkward respect and protective chivalry. Mason maintained a professional distance during the day, focused on his responsibilities as trail boss. But in the evenings, after the cattle were settled and the men gathered around the campfire, he often found himself seated beside Delia, their conversations continuing where they had left off at the ranch. "Tell me about your family," she asked one night, the firelight playing across her features. "You know almost everything about me, but you rarely speak of yourself." Mason poked at the fire with a stick, watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri, parents had a small farm, decided farming wasn't for me and headed west when I was 18. And—" She prompted, sensing there was more. Mason rarely spoke of his past, but something about the quiet night and Delia's gentle persistence loosened his tongue. "Met a woman in Colorado, Esther. We married young, had a daughter, Emma." He paused, the familiar ache returning. "Lost them both to cholera 5 years ago." "Oh, Mason," Delia's hand found his in the darkness. "I'm so sorry." "It was a long time ago." He didn't pull his hand away. "Came to Arizona afterward, been working at Sleeping Creek ever since." They sat in silence for a long moment, the crackling fire and distant lowing of cattle the only sounds. Mason was acutely aware of Delia's hand still resting on his, a simple human connection he had denied himself for years. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "It helps me understand you better." "Understand what?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Why you stopped that day, why you helped a stranger collapsed in the dust when others might have ridden past." She squeezed his hand before releasing it. "You know what it means to lose everything." Mason didn't respond, but her words settled deep inside him, a truth he hadn't fully acknowledged to himself. The next morning, as the drive continued northward, Mason found himself watching Delia more closely. The way she laughed with Cookie, the gentle manner she used with her borrowed horse, the quiet determination with which she faced each day's challenges. Something was shifting between them, a tentative bridge forming over their shared experiences of loss and resilience. Their peaceful routine was shattered on the 10th day when one of the outriders galloped back to the main group, his face grim. Riders coming, boss, 7 of them moving fast. Mason immediately tensed. Raiders? Can't tell, they're flying no colors I recognize. Get the wagon off the trail, Mason ordered. Tom, Jake, stay with Miss Harrison and Cookie. The rest of you spread out along the herd. As the men moved to their positions, Delia approached Mason, her face pale but composed. What is it? Probably nothing, he reassured her, though his hand rested on his revolver. Could be travelers, could be trouble. Either way, stay with the wagon and keep your head down. The approaching riders slowed as they neared the cattle drive, obviously assessing the situation. Mason rode out to meet them, 2 of his most trusted men flanking him. As the distance closed, he felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The lead rider, a well-dressed man with a neat mustache, looked vaguely familiar. I'm looking for a woman, the man called without preamble. Delia Harrison. I have reason to believe she's traveling with you. Mason kept his expression neutral. Who's asking? Edward Phillips from Tucson. The man smiled without warmth. Miss Harrison is my fiancé. She's been unwell. Her family is quite concerned. So this was the man who had driven Delia to flee into the desert. Mason's dislike was immediate and profound. No one by that name here, he said flatly. Just me and my men driving cattle to Santa Fe. Philip's eyes narrowed. I have information that suggests otherwise. A woman matching her description was seen at Sleeping Creek Ranch, then leaving with this very cattle drive. Your information is wrong. Mason stared coldly at the man. Now, unless you're looking to buy cattle, I suggest you move along. We've got a schedule to keep. Phillips glanced at his companions, then back at Mason. I don't think you understand, Mr. Garrett, Mason Garrett, Mr. Garrett. Delia is my future wife. If you're harboring her, you're interfering in a private family matter. Like I said, no one by that name here. And this is open range. You have no authority to search my drive. The standoff stretched for several tense moments before Phillips smiled thinly. Very well, we'll be on our way, but if you should happen to see Miss Harrison, please inform her that I'm most eager to reunite with her. The thinly veiled threat wasn't lost on Mason. He watched as Phillips and his men rode off, not relaxing until they were well out of sight. When he returned to the chuck wagon, Delia was trembling, her face ashen. It was him, wasn't it? She asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. Mason nodded grimly. Edward Phillips says he's looking for his fiancé. I'm not his fiancé, she said fiercely. I broke our engagement before I left. I told him you weren't here. Mason glanced in the direction Phillips had gone, but he didn't believe me. And he knows we're headed to Santa Fe. Delia wrapped her arms around herself. He'll be waiting for me there. Mason gathered the men, explaining the situation in brief, no-nonsense terms. We've got trouble trailing us. I need eyes watching our back trail at all times, double the night watch. That evening, after the cattle were settled, Mason found Delia sitting alone at the edge of camp, staring into the gathering darkness. We'll protect you, he said, settling beside her. None of the men will let Phillips take you anywhere. You don't understand. Delia's voice was hollow. Edward doesn't give up when he wants something, and his family has connections everywhere, even in Santa Fe. I was a fool to think I could escape him. You're not going back to him, Mason said with quiet intensity. I promise you that. She turned to look at him, searching his face. Why do you care so much, Mason? You barely know me. The question caught him off guard, forcing him to examine feelings he'd been avoiding. I know enough, he said finally. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you deserve better than a man who treats you like property. And she prompted softly. Mason took a deep breath. And I care about what happens to you more than I expected to. In the moonlight, he saw tears well in her eyes. I care about you too, she whispered, but my problems shouldn't become yours. Too late, he said, attempting a smile. They already are. That night, Mason barely slept, his mind working through options and scenarios. By morning, he had formed a plan. He approached Frederick Thornton's foreman, Jake Sullivan, who was second in command on the drive. "I need you to take over as trail boss," Mason said without preamble. Jake's eyebrows shot up. "Something wrong, Mason. Phillips and his men will be watching the trail to Santa Fe. Miss Harrison won't be safe if she continues with the drive." Understanding dawned on Jake's weathered face. "You're planning to take her somewhere else," Mason nodded. "There's a small settlement about 3 days' ride west of here. Clearwater, friend of mine runs the general store. Phillips won't think to look there." "And after that, I haven't figured that part out yet," Mason admitted. "But it'll give us time to think of something more permanent." Jake studied him for a moment. "This mean a lot to you, doesn't it? The girl's safety." Mason met his gaze steadily. "Yes, then go. We can manage the drive without you." Jake clapped him on the shoulder. "Just be careful." Men like Phillips don't take kindly to losing. Convincing Delia proved more challenging. "I can't let you risk your position, your livelihood for me," she protested when Mason explained his plan. "Mr. Thornton will understand, and there will be other cattle drives. But what about your men?" "The responsibility. Jake Sullivan is more than capable of leading the drive to Santa Fe." Mason took her hands in his, an unusually demonstrative gesture for him. "Delia, Phillips knows we're headed to Santa Fe. He'll be waiting. This is the only way to ensure your safety." She looked down at their joined hands. "And after Clearwater, what then?" "We'll figure that out together," Mason promised. "One step at a time." They left before dawn the next morning, Mason on Thunderbolt and Delia on a gentle mare named Daisy. They carried only what they could fit in their saddlebags: food, water, a change of clothes, and the few personal items Delia had managed to bring from Tucson. Mason also packed his rifle and extra ammunition, unwilling to take chances with Phillips still in the territory. Their route took them away from the established trails, through rougher country that would be difficult to track. Mason set a steady pace, conscious of Delia's still recovering strength and the need to keep the horses fresh in case of pursuit. They made camp the first night in a sheltered canyon, Mason building a small fire that would be difficult to spot from a distance. As they ate a simple meal of beans and dried beef, Delia broke the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "Tell me about this friend in Clearwater," she said, wrapping her hands around a tin cup of coffee to ward off the evening chill. "Samuel Williams. We served together briefly in the Army before coming west. He opened a general store in Clearwater about 4 years ago. Married a local woman, has 2 young children now." Mason smiled at the memory. "Good man, trustworthy. And you think he'll help us?" "Without question." Mason added a small branch to the fire. "Clearwater's a small place, mostly farmers and a few ranchers." "Not the sort of town Phillips would think to search." Delia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And after we've hidden there, what happens then?" It was the question Mason had been wrestling with since formulating his plan. "That depends on what you want, Delia." "What I want." She looked genuinely surprised. "Yes, where do you see yourself going? What kind of life are you hoping to build?" Delia was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I hadn't thought beyond escape," she admitted finally. "I just wanted to be free of Edward, to go somewhere he couldn't control me." She glanced up at Mason. "What about you? What do you want?" The question stirred something deep within him, possibilities he had long since abandoned. "I've been drifting since I lost my family," he said slowly. "Working cattle drives, moving from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. And now I'm not so sure that's what I want anymore." He met her gaze across the fire, allowing himself to acknowledge the growing connection between them. "Finding you in the desert." "It changed something." Delia's eyes softened. "For me too, Mason." The admission hung in the air between them, neither quite ready to define what was developing but both recognizing its presence. They finished their meal in companionable silence, the unspoken understanding a comfort in the wilderness. The second day of travel brought them into increasingly rugged terrain. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, promising a storm by nightfall. "We should find shelter," Mason said, eyeing the approaching weather. There's a line shack that belongs to the Circle M Ranch about 2 hours from here. We might make it before the storm hits." They pushed the horses harder, racing against the darkening sky. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the crude line shack came into view. A simple one-room structure built for cowboys working the far reaches of ranch land. They reached the shelter, just as the heavens opened, rain pouring down in sheets that reduced visibility to mere feet. Mason helped Delia dismount, then quickly led the horses to a lean-to attached to the side of the shack. Inside, the line shack was basic but sound: a small cast iron stove, a narrow cot, a rough-hewn table with a single chair, and various supplies left for cowboys on the range. Mason quickly started a fire in the stove while Delia shook out her damp skirts. "It's not much," Mason apologized, "but it'll keep us dry." "It's perfect," Delia replied, her smile genuine as she surveyed their temporary haven. As the storm raged outside, they prepared a simple meal from their provisions, the small space growing warm and comfortable with the stove's heat. The close quarters created an intimacy neither had anticipated, heightening their awareness of each other. "You should take the cot," Mason said as evening deepened outside. "I'll make do on the floor." Delia looked at the narrow bed, then back at Mason. "You've hardly slept in days watching out for me. That floor looks terribly hard." "I've slept on worse." A flash of lightning illuminated the shack, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Delia jumped, instinctively moving closer to Mason. "Sorry," she said, embarrassed. "I've never liked storms." Without thinking, Mason reached out, his hand gently touching her arm in reassurance. "It's just passing through. We're safe here." Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them. Mason was acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the gentle rise and fall of Delia's chest as she breathed, of the way her lips parted slightly as she looked up at him. "Mason," she whispered, his name a question and an invitation. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Mason lowered his head until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as Delia responded, her arms sliding up to encircle his neck. When they finally broke apart, Mason rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that since the moment you opened your eyes at Sleeping Creek," he admitted. Delia's smile was radiant. "I've been hoping you would." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the line shack, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one of awakening feelings and possibilities neither had dared to consider before this moment. They spent the night talking, sharing stories and dreams long suppressed, punctuated by increasingly confident kisses and tender touches. By silent mutual agreement, they went no further, both aware of their precarious situation and the importance of clear heads in the days ahead. "Whatever happens," Delia said as dawn approached and they finally prepared for a few hours of sleep, "I want you to know that finding you or you finding me has been the greatest blessing of my life." Mason, unaccustomed to expressing such sentiments, simply held her close, his actions speaking what words could not. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind mud and swollen streams that slowed their progress toward Clearwater. They rode side by side when the terrain permitted, their new understanding bringing both comfort and a sense of shared purpose. "Tell me more about Clearwater," Delia requested as they navigated a particularly rocky stretch. "What kind of place is it?" "Small, maybe 200 people. One main street with the general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and a church." Mason helped guide her horse around a fallen tree. "Mostly honest folk making a living from the land, not rich but not desperate either. Do you think there might be work for someone like me there?" "Sewing or teaching, perhaps," Mason considered. "Samuel would know better than me, but I'd wager they could use a skilled seamstress, and the town's been growing. Might need a school teacher before long." Delia's expression brightened. "I'd like that. Teaching, I mean. My father always said I had a knack for explaining things clearly." "You'd be good at it," Mason agreed, enjoying the way her face lit up at the prospect. It was the first time she'd spoken of the future with genuine enthusiasm rather than fear. They made camp that night by a small stream, both aware that tomorrow would likely bring them to Clearwater and decisions that could no longer be postponed. "Mason," Delia said as they sat beside their small fire. "There's something I need to ask you." He looked up from cleaning his revolver. "Anything? When we reach Clearwater, what do you intend to do?" Her voice was carefully neutral. "Will you return to the cattle drive, to Sleeping Creek?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Mason set aside his weapon, giving the matter the consideration it deserved. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I haven't thought beyond getting you to safety. And if I were safe in Clearwater, if there was work for me there, a place I could stay," Mason met her gaze across the fire. "Are you asking if I would leave you there alone?" "I'm asking what you want," Delia said softly. "For yourself, for your future." The answer came to Mason with surprising clarity. 5 days ago, I would have said I wanted nothing more than to finish the cattle drive and return to Sleeping Creek. To continue as I have been. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now I find I want something different." "What do you want, Mason?" Delia's voice was barely above a whisper. "A chance." He reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "A chance to see if what's growing between us might flourish. A chance to build something permanent instead of just drifting." Tears glistened in Delia's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "That's what I want too." They reached Clearwater shortly after noon the following day, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley beside a clear, swift-running stream that gave the settlement its name. Mason led them directly to Williams' General Store, a 2-story building with living quarters above the shop. Samuel Williams proved to be everything Mason had described: welcoming, trustworthy, and quick to understand their situation without requiring elaborate explanations. "Any friend of Mason's is welcome in my home," he assured Delia, after introductions were made and a highly edited version of their circumstances explained. "My wife, Rebecca, will be delighted to have another woman to talk to, and we have a spare room you can use for as long as needed." Rebecca Williams, a warm, practical woman with a ready smile, immediately took Delia under her wing. "You look exhausted, poor dear. Come upstairs and rest while the men talk business." Once the women had gone, Samuel's expression turned serious. "Now, old friend, tell me what kind of trouble you're really in." Mason gave him the unvarnished truth: Delia's flight from an abusive fiancé, Philip's pursuit, and their desperate detour to Clearwater. Samuel whistled low. "And this Philip's fellow has money and connections." "Enough to make him dangerous," Mason confirmed. "He's not the type to give up easily." "And your interest in the lady?" Samuel asked, a knowing glint in his eye. "Purely protective, is it?" Mason felt a rare flush creep up his neck. "It started that way." Samuel clapped him on the shoulder, grinning. "Well, well, never thought I'd see the day Mason Garrett fell for anyone, let alone so quickly." "It's not like that," Mason protested, though without conviction. "We've just connected, eh?" Samuel's grin widened. "Well, connected or not, you're both welcome here until you figure out your next move. And as it happens, we might be able to help with more than just shelter." Over the next hour, Samuel outlined possibilities that made Mason's newly forming plans seem increasingly viable. Clearwater needed skilled workers of all kinds as the town grew. There was demand for a seamstress, and the town council had been discussing the need for a proper school. Moreover, a small ranch at the edge of town had recently come up for sale when its elderly owner decided to move east to live with his daughter. "It's nothing fancy," Samuel explained. 100 acres, small house, decent water, but it could be a start for someone looking to put down roots. Mason's mind raced with possibilities. He had savings from years of careful living, enough to make a down payment on a small property, and if Delia could find work in town while he built up a small herd. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" Samuel asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Maybe," Mason admitted, "but there's still Phillips to consider. He won't stop looking for her." Samuel's expression turned thoughtful. "Clearwater's off the main trails, and folks here are loyal to their own, if you and Miss Harrison were to become part of the community." He let the implication hang. "You think we could disappear here?" "I think you could build a life here," Samuel corrected, "which is a different thing entirely from disappearing." That evening, over a home-cooked meal that reminded Mason how long it had been since he'd enjoyed such comforts, he shared Samuel's information with Delia. Her eyes grew wide as he outlined the possibilities Clearwater offered. A school, she repeated, hope blossoming in her expression. They truly need a teacher. According to Samuel, the town council has been discussing it for months. There are enough children now to warrant a proper school, not just lessons at home. And the ranch, she asked cautiously, you'd consider staying, giving up trail life? Mason met her gaze across the table, aware of Samuel and Rebecca listening with poorly disguised interest. I've been thinking it might be time for a change. If you were amenable to the idea of building something here, together. Delia's cheeks flushed pink. Together, she repeated softly. I'd like that very much, Mason. Later, when Samuel and Rebecca had tactfully retired upstairs, leaving Mason and Delia alone by the hearth, they spoke more frankly about their developing feelings and tentative plans. It's happening so quickly, Delia marveled. 2 weeks ago, I was fleeing for my life with no plan beyond escape. Now I'm considering a teaching position and... She hesitated, and a future with you. Too quickly, Mason asked, suddenly uncertain. We've known each other such a short time. Delia considered this, her expression thoughtful. My mother used to say that some people spend years together and never truly know each other, while others connect deeply in days. It's not the time that matters, but the understanding. And do you think we understand each other? I think we recognize something in each other, she said softly. A kindred spirit, perhaps, a shared understanding of loss and hope. Mason nodded, feeling the truth of her words. I haven't allowed myself to think of a future like this since I lost Esther and Emma, didn't think I deserved it or could bear to risk losing it again. And now? Now I think perhaps the greater risk would be never trying at all. He took her hand, his calloused fingers entwining with her softer ones. I can't promise it will be easy, Delia. Phillips may still find us. Building a life from scratch will be hard work. And I'm not an easy man to live with, so I'm told. Delia's smile was warm with affection. I don't want easy, Mason. I want real, I want honest, and I want you if you'll have me. In answer, Mason leaned forward and kissed her, pouring 5 years of loneliness and newfound hope into the gesture. The next morning, they rode out with Samuel to view the available ranch property. The land was promising gently rolling hills with good grass, a year-round creek, and enough timber for building and winter fuel. The house was small but solid, with 2 rooms downstairs and a loft above, a stone fireplace, and a covered porch facing west toward distant mountains. What do you think? Mason asked as they stood on the porch, surveying what could become their home. Delia turned in a slow circle, taking in the weathered boards, the overgrown garden patch, the empty corral that needed mending. It needs work, she said honestly, but I can see what it could be. A home. The word resonated between them, filled with promise and possibility. They spent the next week in Clearwater, Mason negotiating the purchase of the ranch while Delia met with the town council about the proposed school. To their mutual delight, both endeavors progressed smoothly. The ranch owner accepted Mason's offer, and the council was enthusiastic about Delia's qualifications and ideas for education. They want me to start as soon as possible, Delia reported excitedly after her meeting. They're offering to convert the old meeting hall into a schoolroom until a proper school building can be constructed. That's wonderful, Mason said, genuinely pleased by her happiness. Will it be difficult teaching children of different ages together? Challenging, yes, but not impossible. I grew up watching my father manage just such a school. Her expression softened with memory. He always said the older children learn responsibility by helping the younger ones, and the younger ones are inspired to reach higher. As they settled into the rhythm of Clearwater, Mason found himself thinking less about Phillips and more about the future they were building. He purchased a small herd of cattle to start their ranch, hired 2 local boys as part-time help, and began repairs on the house and outbuildings. Delia divided her time between preparing for the school's opening and making the ranch house a home. Her skilled hands transformed simple muslin into curtains, repaired furniture found in the town's storage shed, and created a kitchen garden that promised fresh vegetables by summer's end. In the evenings, they sat on the porch watching the sunset, planning and dreaming aloud. Sometimes Samuel and Rebecca joined them, or other neighbors Mason was beginning to consider friends. The sense of community was something he had forgotten, a balm to his long, solitary spirit. "Are you happy here?" Delia asked one evening as they sat watching fireflies rise from the meadow grass. "Do you miss the trail?" Mason considered the question honestly. "There are things I miss: the open sky, the rhythm of the drive, the simplicity of knowing exactly what each day will bring." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "But they pale compared to what I've found here." Their relationship deepened as summer progressed, built on shared work and growing understanding. Though they maintained separate bedrooms in the small house, a concession to propriety that both found increasingly frustrating, their evenings often ended with lingering kisses and reluctant good nights. "We should make this official," Mason said one night as they walked back from dinner with the Williams family. "If you're ready." Delia squeezed his hand. "Are you proposing, Mason Garrett?" "Not very romantically," he admitted ruefully. "I should have planned something better." "I don't need romance," she assured him. "Just you." The following Sunday, they spoke with Reverend Thomas about their intentions. The minister, a pragmatic man who had seen enough of frontier life to value substance over convention, agreed to publish the bans for the customary 3 weeks. "Though I dare say no one in town will be surprised," he noted with a twinkle in his eye. "You two have been the talk of Clearwater since you arrived." News of their engagement spread quickly through the small community, bringing a flurry of well wishes and practical gifts: preserved foods, handmade linens, a rocking chair crafted by the town's carpenter. Each gesture reinforced their growing sense of belonging. 3 days before the wedding, as Mason was returning from checking fence lines on the far edge of their property, he spotted a dust cloud on the horizon. Riders, moving fast toward the ranch house where Delia was alone preparing dinner. Cold dread washed over him as he urged his horse into a gallop. The distance seemed endless, though in reality it was less than a mile back to the house. As he crested the final rise, he saw 4 riders already dismounting in the yard. Even at a distance, he recognized Edward Phillips. Mason's hand went to his revolver as he raced down the slope, but before he could close the distance, the front door of the house opened. Delia stepped onto the porch, a shotgun held confidently in her hands, aimed directly at Phillips. "That's far enough, Edward," she called, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "You're trespassing on private property." Phillips raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Now, Delia, is that any way to greet your fiancé? I've been searching for you for months." "I am not your fiancé," Delia replied steadily. "I made that clear before I left Tucson. Please leave my home." "Your home," Phillips laughed. "This miserable little farm. Come now, darling. I've come to take you back to civilization, to the life you deserve." "The life I deserve is the one I'm building here," Delia said, the shotgun never wavering. "With my future husband." At that moment, Mason rode into the yard, dismounting in one fluid motion, his revolver drawn but held at his side. "You heard the lady, Phillips. Time for you to leave." Phillips turned, his face darkening with recognition. "Garrett, I should have known. You lied to me on the trail." "I protected someone who needed protection," Mason corrected, moving to stand beside Delia on the porch. "Something you wouldn't understand." Phillips assessed the situation, his gaze moving from Mason's determined expression to Delia's unwavering stance with the shotgun. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. "Delia," he tried again, his tone wheedling. "Think about what you're giving up." "My family's position, the comfort you'd enjoy in Tucson, all for this, Cowboy and his pitiful ranch." "I've made my choice, Edward." Delia's voice was calm but firm. "And it's not you, it never would have been you, even if Mason hadn't found me that day." A tense silence fell over the yard, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses. Philip's companions exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Mr. Phillips," one of them said quietly, "perhaps we should reconsider. The lady seems quite decided." Phillips ignored him, his face flushing with anger. "You can't hide here forever, Delia. Sooner or later, you'll realize your mistake." "The only mistake I made was believing your lies in the first place," Delia replied. "Now please leave, before I'm forced to demonstrate how well my future husband has taught me to use this shotgun." For a moment, it seemed Phillips might refuse. His hand twitched toward his own weapon, and Mason tensed, ready to intervene. But something in Delia's steady gaze, or perhaps the unwavering aim of the shotgun, made Phillips reconsider. "This isn't over," he said, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Yes, it is," Mason countered. "Clearwater protects its own, Phillips, and Delia is one of us now. You do well to remember that." With a final venomous glare, Phillips mounted his horse and signaled to his companions. They rode out of the yard in a cloud of dust, heading back toward the main road. Mason waited until they were well out of sight before turning to Delia, who had finally lowered the shotgun. "Are you all right?" To his surprise, she was smiling, a mixture of relief and triumph in her expression. "I've never been better," she said. "That felt liberating." Mason suggested slipping an arm around her waist. "Exactly." She leaned against him, the tension draining from her body. "Do you think he'll come back?" Mason considered the question. "He might try, but he saw something today he didn't expect." "What's that, you standing your ground?" "Not the frightened woman who fled into the desert." Mason pressed a kiss to her temple. "Men like Phillips prey on fear. When they don't find it, they usually move on to easier targets." Delia nodded thoughtfully. "I wasn't afraid," she realized. "Not really. I was angry that he thought he could just walk back into my life and reclaim me like lost property." "You were magnificent," Mason said simply. That evening, they rode into town to inform Samuel and the sheriff about Philip's visit. Both men assured them that the town would be watching for any sign of Phillips or his companions returning. "Might be best to move up that wedding," Samuel suggested with practical concern. "Legal ties tend to discourage men like Phillips, makes his claims even harder to press." Reverend Thomas, consulted over the matter, agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday, dispensing with the final week of banns given the circumstances. "The Lord understands practicality," he assured them, "especially out here." The wedding day dawned clear and warm, a perfect late summer morning. The entire town of Clearwater seemed to have turned out for the occasion, filling the small church to capacity and spilling onto the steps outside. Delia wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with lace collar and cuffs sent by Rebecca's sister from Denver. Mason, uncomfortable in his best shirt and newly purchased suit, waited at the altar with Samuel as his best man, his expression a mixture of nervousness and profound joy. When Delia walked down the aisle on the arm of Sheriff Taylor, who had volunteered to give her away, Mason felt his breath catch. The woman who had collapsed in the dust barely 3 months ago now moved toward him with confident grace, her face radiant with happiness. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, their vows spoken clearly for all to witness. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from the congregation seemed to ratify not just their union but their place in the community. The celebration continued at the town hall, with food contributed by every family in Clearwater, music provided by local musicians, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Mason, never comfortable in crowds, found himself surprisingly at ease among people he now considered friends and neighbors. "Happy, Mrs. Garrett?" he asked, finding a quiet moment with his bride as the festivities continued around them. Delia's smile was answer enough, but she rose on tiptoes to kiss him softly. "More than I ever thought possible. And you, Mr. Garrett, any regrets about picking up a half-dead woman from the desert? Only that I didn't find you sooner," he replied, pulling her close. "We've wasted enough time, don't you think?" Her blush was all the answer he needed. They slipped away from the celebration as the sun was setting, riding back to their ranch, truly their home now, in companionable silence, both contemplating the night ahead and the future stretching before them. The house was quiet and welcoming, the lamps already lit by a thoughtful neighbor who had ridden ahead to prepare for their return. Mason lifted Delia from her horse and carried her across the threshold, an old tradition his mother had always insisted was important. "Welcome home, wife," he said softly, setting her gently on her feet in the main room. "Home," Delia repeated, looking around at the simple space they had worked so hard to make their own. "It's a beautiful word, isn't it?" Later, as moonlight streamed through the bedroom window, casting silver patterns across the bed they now shared, Mason traced the curve of Delia's cheek with gentle fingers. "I never thought I'd find this again," he confessed, his voice husky with emotion. "After losing Esther and Emma, I was certain that part of my life was over." Delia covered his hand with her own. "And I never thought I'd find it at all, not real love." She smiled in the darkness. "It seems we both needed to be proven wrong." "Thankfully," Mason agreed, drawing her closer. The seasons turned, marking the passage of time with natural rhythms that shaped their lives together. Delia's school flourished, growing from 12 students to 20 by the following spring. Mason's small herd expanded, the ranch prospered, and their home evolved from a simple shelter to a true reflection of their shared life. Edward Phillips never returned to Clearwater. They heard through Samuel's business connections that he had married a banker's daughter from Phoenix, apparently finding a match more aligned with his ambitions. "Poor woman," Delia commented when they received the news. "I hope she fares better than I would have." A year after their wedding, as autumn painted the surrounding hills in gold and crimson, Delia shared news that completed their happiness. By the following summer, the house would welcome a new addition to their family. "A child," Mason marveled, his hand gentle on the slight curve of her belly. "Our child. Are you pleased?" Delia asked, though his expression left little doubt. "Beyond words," he assured her. Though also terrified, she laughed, the sound as bright and clear as the day he'd first heard it. "That makes two of us. But we'll figure it out together, just as we have everything else." On a warm June morning, with the help of Rebecca Williams and the town's midwife, Delia gave birth to a healthy daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth Garrett. Mason, pacing nervously on the porch throughout the long night, was finally called inside to meet his daughter, a tiny bundle with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same hazel as her mother's. "She's perfect," he whispered, cradling her with careful hands that had grown accustomed to gentleness through loving Delia. "She is," Delia agreed, exhausted but radiant, "and she's ours." As he looked from his daughter to his wife, Mason felt the final piece of his heart heal, the long journey from loss to renewal complete. From the moment he had spotted a woman collapsed in the dust and lifted her gently into his saddle, his life had been steering toward this moment, this family, this home, this love. Outside, the vast expanse of the western frontier stretched in all directions, still wild and untamed in many ways. But within the walls of their home on the edge of Clearwater, Mason and Delia Garrett had found their own frontier, a future they would build together, day by day, season by season, with the same courage and determination that had brought them to each other in the first place. And that, Mason reflected as he settled on the bed beside Delia, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them, was a journey worth every step.